Chris Linder, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Ed Leadership and Policy and the director for the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention at the University of Utah. I'm excited to be here with you today to talk a little bit about historical and power-conscious approaches to addressing sexual violence among college students. As we get started, I think it's important to point out that institutions of higher education mostly exist on land that was stolen from indigenous people, that European colonizers stole from indigenous people through violence, and most specifically sexual violence. The land that I work from at the University of Utah belongs to the Bannock, Goshute, Navajo, Paiute, Shoshone, and Ute peoples. And I also think it's always important to point out, in addition to this exploited and stolen land, most of our institutions of higher education were also built by exploited and enslaved people. Usually institutions of higher education were built or owned by white people who also owned slaves, and those enslaved people were used to build institutions of higher education. I think it's important to acknowledge that this is how we gained the level of wealth that we have today. As we move forward in doing work related to relationship and sexual violence, I think it's important to acknowledge this land and labor exploitation, as well as to pay attention to our responsibility to call attention to and interrupt exploitation as often as possible through our own work. I also think it's important to note that the current moment that we're in, where people are finally waking up and paying attention to the ways that racism exists in our culture, and specifically the relationship between racism and violence, is very important in our work related to relationship and sexual violence. So as you can see here, there are lots of demonstrations of people in our country right now paying attention to the ways that racism and violence intersect. And for me, it's important to point out that sexual misconduct is actually the second most frequently reported form of police violence after excessive force. So these movements happening in the United States right now related to addressing racism and police violence are not separate from our work related to relationship and sexual violence. They're very tightly woven together, and we must work together to make sure that we're paying attention to both as we move forward in this activism. I also think it's important to always start by sharing a little bit about who I am and what I bring to this work. I think that our identities and experiences inform how we go about doing the work that we do, whether we're conscious of them or not. So the ones that I pay very close attention to are that I identify as a queer, white, cisgender woman from a working class background, socialized here in the US. These are the identities that are most salient to me. They're the ones that I think about the most frequently, the ones that show up in my work regularly. Now you'll see here that there are ones missing. There are identities that I don't list here. So for example, my ability is not listed here. That's because it's an area in which I have privilege and I haven't spent the level of time required to claim it as a salient identity for me. It's something that I work on and I'm continually working on, but it's not something that I'm as cognizant of as, say, for example, my white identity or my cisgender identity. So I think it's just important to illustrate that we're constantly learning about ourselves and how our identities influence the work that we do. I also identify as a secondary survivor of interpersonal violence. So I grew up in a home where violence existed until I was about 13 years old. And so that's definitely something that I carry with me and bring to my work. I also approach this work from a very both and place. So when I say both and, what I mean is that there are often tensions in the work that we do, and it's important for me to recognize that those both can be true at the same time. So a really strong example of this for me is that I do believe perpetrators should be held accountable for their harmful behaviors. And also, I don't think that the criminal justice system is always the way to do that, because the way our criminal justice system is set up is so tightly wound with the history of racism and classism and ableism and heterosexism in our country. And so this for me is an example of that both and that I have to hold together. It's also important for me to point out that relationship and sexual violence, I approach it as an equity issue, tightly wound with all forms of oppression, which we're going to get lots of examples of throughout the discussion today. I think it's important to note this because on college campuses, we frequently talk about relationship and sexual violence as a health issue. Often it's very tightly wound with alcohol education, and I think it's important to interrupt this and point out the ways that power also influences how relationship and sexual violence play out among college students. Additionally, I worked full-time as an administrator in student affairs on college campuses for 10 years, primarily in a women's center. They were called women's centers at the time. And that center had the primary responsibility for interpersonal violence response and education on campus. I'm now a faculty member in a higher education program at the University of Utah, and specifically my areas of research focus on campus sexual violence, student activism, and race and gender in higher education. So these are a couple of books that I have either edited or authored in case you're interested in learning a little bit more about me. I'm going to pause here for a minute because I would like for folks to do this on their own. So I want you to think for just about 3 or 4 minutes about yourself. I just modeled for you what my identities and experiences are that I think influence how I approach this work. I shared with you some of the assumptions I bring to this work, and now I'd like to ask you to do something similar. So I'm just going to pause for about 2 minutes here so that you can do this. Okay, the 2 minutes is up. The next time you get together with the other folks that you work with on your campus related to issues of relationship and sexual violence, I'd like to encourage you to engage in this exercise with them. So talk about what it is that you bring to the work and what each other's assumptions are. Whenever I facilitate this with students, they find that it's really helpful for them to hear from their peers, and it sort of helps to illuminate what it is that each of us is bringing to this work. I also think it's important to note that rates of sexual violence on our campus have not changed since 1957. So the first documented study of addressing or rates of sexual assault on or sexual harassment on college campuses took place in 1957. And at that time, rates of violence were about 1 out of 5 women experienced some sort of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct. Now, today we do the studies a little bit differently in that we really try to focus on more than just cisgender women in most of the research that we do. And also we acknowledge various kinds of relationship and sexual violence. So we don't just focus on sexual harassment anymore, but the most commonly cited statistic of college women who experience completed or attempted sexual assault is about 1 in 4. So we can see that the numbers have not changed dramatically since 1957, which is highly troubling to me. I think it's also important to point out, I think sometimes people have questions about this, that there's a big difference between rates of sexual violence and reports of sexual violence. So when we talk about reports, we're talking about students who actually go and tell an authority of some sort at the university that they experienced some form of violence. So that could be reporting it to the police, that could be reporting it to a Title IX officer, that in some cases it could be reporting it to the victim advocacy office on the campus. Those are reports. So those numbers are actually very, very low because we know that the vast majority of people who experience violence don't actually go tell anybody other than their friends that they experienced this. Rates of sexual violence, however, are very different. Rates of sexual violence are determined based on surveys, usually campus climate studies that most campuses do. And these are much more accurate numbers of people who are actually experiencing violence because we're not asking people, have you ever been sexually assaulted? We're asking, have you ever experienced? And then we list a whole bunch of behaviors that match the definition of sexual assault, but don't call it sexual assault. So that's how we get what we refer to as rates, which I just want to point out are different than reports of sexual violence. I also think it's important to point out that sexual violence is wound with all forms of oppression. I talked about this earlier, but how we know this is that we know that perpetrators are targeting bisexual women, gay men, trans people, indigenous women, and women with disabilities at even higher rates than their peers. So that 1 in 4 statistic that we often hear, I think it's important to note that that statistic largely focuses on dominant groups. So usually that's referring to heterosexual, cisgender white women at colleges and universities. And when we break down that number even further, we can see that the numbers of people or how people are affected vary dramatically. The other thing it's important to note is that the vast majority of our educational programs, our research, all of the work that we're doing on college campuses focus on victimization risk factors and not oppression and interrupting perpetration. So some students and I did a study a few years ago where we looked at 10 years worth of research on college campuses related to relationship and sexual violence. And we found that more than 50% of the published research focused on victimization risk factors and less than 10% of the research focused on perpetration. So what that tells us is that we have a lot of work to do around understanding perpetration and that we have even more work to do around interrupting and addressing perpetration as part of our educational programs. So today's discussion is going to focus on this idea of power consciousness. So this is a graphic illustrating what the power conscious framework is. I'm not going to go into all the details about each of these pillars and tenets of the framework. You are welcome to read that on your own. People have shared with me that they find the framework really applicable. But basically what the framework comes down to is that we need to consciously and explicitly shift our framework from fixing minoritized groups to holding people with power accountable for changing their behaviors. So for example, when we do work related to relationship and sexual violence on college campuses, we're frequently teaching people how not to become a victim, and we rarely teach people how not to cause harm. So that's an example of shifting that framework to make sure that we're teaching people with power how they are either intentionally or unintentionally causing harm by being unaware of that power. So what is power? When we're talking about power, there are lots of ways to think about it. But for me, the way that I think about power is that it's our ability to influence our own and other people's experiences. So sometimes this is something we're highly conscious of. Other times we're completely not paying attention to it at all. It's not something that we think about. Power shows up in both formal and informal ways. So we have formal power when we're in some sort of a position of power over other people. So supervisors over people that they supervise is an example of a formal power structure. Informal power structures are closely related to our identity. So these are the ways that we often don't pay attention to the ways that we have power. So, for example, in mainstream US culture, white people have access to power that we aren't always conscious of. And that power comes in the form of not having to think about particular things, not having to be mindful of the ways that our whiteness gets us access to various and different kinds of resources. We've started to hear more about this as it relates to engaging with police and authority. We'll give some more examples of this in a bit. And like I said, this is tightly wound with our identities. So all of us have identities in which we experience power, and we have identities in which we have less access to power. So you'll note here that there's nothing inherently wrong with power. The problem becomes when people use power to exert influence over people that they shouldn't be using that power for, and when they abuse that power to consistently cause harm to other people. Again, sometimes this is conscious, sometimes people are doing it very intentionally and overtly, and other times it's very subconscious. They don't even know they're exerting power, and they don't know that other people don't have the kind of power that they do. As we move forward today, I want to present to you three big ideas and then wrap up with how those ideas influence our work today. So the first idea I want to talk about is the idea that history matters. So ahistoricism leads to incomplete and ineffective movements. So we often hear people saying, oh, the 1970s were such a heyday for feminists. We did so much work around all kinds of activism, and anti-rape activism happens to be one of those areas that we frequently talk about. I'm here today to interrupt that notion that started in the 1970s. Yes, we did a lot of really good work in the 1970s, but the activism started long before the 1970s. So I'm going to give sort of a very brief or an abbreviated history of the ways that power, race, and violence are interwoven throughout the history of the United States. With all topics related to looking at racism, looking at violence, parts of this are hard to hear. So do what you need to do to take care of yourself as I move through this. I'm also giving a very brief overview, but at the end of the presentation, I provide you with lots of resources if you want to go learn more about any of these pieces. So in our history, in the history of the United States, we know that this country, like I already talked about, was founded on colonization, and that we know that rape was used as a tool of terrorization and economic control directed toward indigenous communities and enslaved people. So I think something that we don't talk very often about is that the children of enslaved people also became the property of the white people who owned enslaved people. And so there was great incentive for slave owners to push the people that they own, the enslaved people that they own, to have more children. And so sometimes they would do this by actually raping enslaved women themselves, which we've heard some history of that. And then other times they would push enslaved people to have sex with each other in order to increase their labor supply. So rape was very much woven into the fabric of the founding of our country through economic control and people trying to get rich. In the Victorian era, that's when we started to see more laws being enacted to address rape. But what was interesting about these laws is that they were really focused on making sure that white women remained pure. So one of the ways that they did that is that rape laws were actually property crimes during this time period. So property law means that women were the property of men, either their fathers or their husbands. So during this time period, the only people who could file charges of rape were men. And they were doing it as a property crime, saying this lessened the value of the property that I own, my wife or my daughter. Therefore, it caused me economic loss, and I deserve some sort of payment for that. And so that's what was happening during this time period. This is also when we really started to see poor immigrant and indigenous men centered as rapists, which we have seen consistently throughout our history, but it certainly was really present during this time as a way to other men who weren't wealthy and white and elite in the US. The Civil War and Reconstruction is the next period I want to talk about. So during this time period, as throughout all of the history of the United States, when Black folks started to make any sort of progress, or really when any minoritized group started to make any sort of progress, white people would lash out and do something to stop that progress. So during this time period, when Black folks this was after the Civil War, so people who were formerly enslaved were technically free, though we could argue what that actually meant during this time period. But what happened is that white men were using rape as a tool of terrorization and control, meaning that there were lots of instances where white people were going in and burning down Black businesses, tearing up Black people's homes, those sorts of things. And along with that, we're using rape as part of that terrorization. This is also the time period when we first started to see, or not first, but when we really started to see Black men being framed as rapists, and lynching being used as a guise to quote, protect white women from these scary Black men. We know that this was not true, and that Black men were not out raping white women at the rates that people wanted folks to believe during this time period. It's also important to note that Black women were engaged in a lot of resistance during this time period. So Black women have led our movements related to addressing rape and sexual violence throughout the history of the United States, and this time period was no exception to this. So you'll see here on the right, this is a book that Ida B. Wells put together where she actually she was a journalist, and she tracked a number of lynchings that were happening during this time period. And at the same time she was doing that, she was also working really hard to honor Black women's experiences with sexual violence, which had been ignored for a very long time. The Civil Rights Era is another time when we saw activism related to sexual violence, specifically among Black women. So in the bottom right-hand corner, that's a picture of Mrs. Recy Taylor. And Recy Taylor was a person who lived in Alabama. She was walking home from church one night with her family, and she was abducted by a group of white men and taken into the woods and beaten and raped. Rosa Parks, who's in the top right-hand corner, most of us know her as the person who didn't give up her seat on the bus. That's the story we get told. That's the master narrative about Rosa Parks. But during this time period, it was 1944 when this happened to Recy Taylor, Rosa Parks organized to get Mrs. Taylor's case in front of a court. So this was a time period when Black women's experiences were never recognized by courts. And so the activism that happened during this time period is really important to acknowledge, and really important to recognize as a large part of our organizing. The bus boycott movement, which we hear a lot about, was largely run by Black women. Black women were the ones that were using the buses to go to white people's houses to clean them. So they were hugely instrumental in the bus boycott movement, which we hear a lot about, but we also frequently hear men activists as being the leaders of that movement. But Danielle McGuire argues in her book that I have a citation for later, that Black women were actually the ones leading this movement, and that the bus boycott movement was as much about gender as it was about race. The Teflon Crime Era is another time period that we need to pay attention to. So this picture cracks me up. It's all these white men congratulating each other for passing VAWA. So VAWA was passed in 1994. Violence stands for the Violence Against Women Act. And this was very tightly wound with this time period when we saw a ton of increased criminalization related to drug use, specifically targeting communities of color and poor communities. This is when we also continue to see heightened representation of Black and brown men as criminals, which was not that it's not a coincidence that we were having these increased criminalizations. Black and brown men were being represented as perpetrators of all kinds of crimes, and the Senate finally, this white man Senate finally decided to address violence against women. So lots of stereotypes happening here, lots of assumptions. So we often celebrate VAWA as a big moment in the history of movements related to relationship and sexual violence. And yet it's important to note that that wasn't a victory for everyone, that passing VAWA actually was part of contributing to this increased criminalization. And so I think that's important for us to remember as we think about our history. Again, another example of that tension of the both and. Yes, it's good that the government finally started paying attention to this and taking it seriously. And also, when we pass policies without centering minoritized people, we often end up further privileging people with a lot of dominant identities. This is also the time period when the group Insight Women of Color Against Violence emerged as a intersectional voice of resistance. I still, to this day, use that website frequently. It has a ton of good information on it in terms of helping us think through how our movements need to be more intersectional and more cognizant of the ways that minoritized people experience laws and policies and practices related to relationship and sexual violence. So this leads me to my second idea that I want to present, which is the idea that awareness, prevention, and response are all very different things. So we often think of them as one and the same, but when we're talking about awareness, what we're talking about is making people aware that there's a problem, letting people know about what resources exist, that sort of thing. When we talk about response, we're talking about all the stuff that happens after someone experiences violence. So things like criminal justice responses, getting people to report whatever their experience was. So any sort of adjudication or criminal justice processes are examples of response. It's also response to try and get victims the support that they need, whether that's counseling or other kinds of healing. That's a form of response. Another form of response is teaching people how not to get victimized again. Yet again, we're focusing on teaching people how not to get victimized as opposed to not cause harm in the first place. Prevention means that we're trying to stop violence before it even happens. And unfortunately, on college campuses, we spend very little time on this, primarily because we're over relying on Title IX as the policy to address relationship and sexual violence. And Title IX was not even designed to address sexual assault. When I was in college in the 90s, when you heard Title IX, the first thing you thought of was women's sports. People associated Title IX with women's sports because the purpose of Title IX is to ensure that people have equal access to education based on gender. And so all of those co-curricular activities that we do used to not have equal access for men and women on college campuses. And so Title IX was really a law that partially addressed that. We have since moved to using Title IX as a way to address sexual misconduct on college campuses. It is a good argument. If women are experiencing such exceptionally high rates of violence, they certainly don't have access to education in the same way as their male peers. But when we use a law that wasn't designed in the first place to address a particular issue, there are going to be problems with it. And so one of those problems is that Title IX punishes campuses for a bad response, but doesn't really do anything to push campuses to do much work around prevention. So this law review article, I think, really helps to illustrate this. When we talk about engaging in prevention, I think it's important to note that when we talk about this, we're talking about stopping violence before it ever starts. And for me, one of the ways to do that is to really engage with perpetration patterns, perpetrators, those sorts of things. But we rarely talk about this on college and university campuses. So as we start to think about ways that we can engage with people who are causing harm, as we can start to look at patterns of perpetration on our campuses, it's important to look at what we already know about the scholarship about perpetrators on college and university campuses. So one thing that we know is that there's often a misperception about who perpetrators are. So we think either perpetrators aren't actually members of our community, they're people who are sort of out there and they're not part of us. The other thing that we do is we make perpetrators completely invisible. So we never talk about them. And all of our work related to relationship and sexual violence, we're consistently and constantly focusing on victims in our attempts to be victim centered. But what we do know is that about 1 out of 7 college men has committed an act that meets the legal definition of sexual assault. So if we think about that, that's a large number of people on our campus who have engaged in committing acts of sexual violence. So you'll note here that this statistic focuses on men because that's what the majority of research to date has looked at related to perpetration. This does not mean that other people are not engaging in perpetration, but at this point, it's unfortunate that we don't have very much research on other parts of the population, on other people who are engaging in perpetration. The other thing that we do know, though, is that the way that our culture socializes men specifically contributes to these high rates of relationship and sexual violence. So we do know that a very, very large number of perpetrators are cisgender men. That doesn't mean that most men are committing sexual violence, but it does mean most of the people who are doing it are men. So it's important to note that when we're talking about who perpetrators are, there are several things the research does tell us. First of all, they're nice people, they're cool people, they're cute people. They're often even referred to as normal. It's interesting to read the literature about perpetrators on college campuses because they frequently refer to them as normal people, which is striking to me. The other thing we know is that, like I just talked about, men who are socialized in our culture as hyper masculine and often are socialized not to have feelings, that's a contributor to sexual assault, because if you don't have an outlet to express your feelings, that stuff gets bottled up inside and there's no sort of human connection with other people, which results in people engaging in harmful behavior. Perpetrators are also people who ignore boundaries and demand that they get what they want. So that's an important piece to pay attention to. Teaching people how to pay attention to boundaries is really important. Teaching people how to set boundaries, and more importantly, how to respect other people's boundaries, is really significant when we're talking about engaging with people who are causing harm or engaging in perpetration. Another piece of this puzzle is that perpetrators will frequently use alcohol as a tool to make someone more vulnerable so that they can take advantage of them. So unfortunately, a lot of our discussion about alcohol and sexual assault, again, frequently focuses on victims and telling people, don't drink and you won't be a victim. But the reality is perpetrators are very intentionally using alcohol as a weapon. And so if we were to reframe the conversation like that, we might be able to start to pick out more patterns earlier on to identify folks who are causing harm. Another thing we know is that people who engage in perpetration related to relationship and sexual violence are also often people who experience violence themselves growing up. So there's a lot of research or evidence to suggest that people who grow up in violent homes don't know, this is their sort of normal experience, and so it gets perpetuated later on as they grow older. This is how they've been taught to do relationships. So these are just a few of the pieces. Like I talked about before, our research in this area is lacking. We need a lot more attention to this issue, but I wanted to at least share with you a little bit about what we do know about perpetration. The last point I wanted to go over is that one of the things we see on our campuses is, we've talked about this a number of times, but I'm just going to give some examples now, are the ways that our prevention programs focus on everything except for perpetrators. So you can see here, this sign here is an advertisement for a self-defense class. Now, this was not a self-defense class that took place in 1950. This flyer came out in the spring of 2018. This is not an old school back in the day kind of thing. But you can see here some of the challenges with this kind of prevention programming is that it's very much focused on women. It's teaching us that we need to be prepared to defend ourselves. The picture itself, whenever I show this, people always say, why are they fighting each other? Which also makes me kind of giggle, because why are they fighting each other? And so a lot of people will push back on me and say, yeah, but some people really benefit from self-defense classes. And I think that's true. Some people really want self-defense classes, and I think that's a-okay. What's challenging is a lot of people will see this poster and think, oh, I need to do this, it's my responsibility. If they're a survivor, they may think, oh, if I would have taken self-defense, maybe that wouldn't have happened to me. So there's sort of this self-blame or victim blaming stuff that happens. So certainly it's okay to have self-defense classes. Well, what I think could be helpful is if we add a note somewhere on here making it very explicit that it's a perpetrator's responsibility to not cause harm. There's nothing that we can do. And so just acknowledging that it's never a victim's sole responsibility to end violence, but if they want to do things that make themselves feel safer, that's okay. Here's another example of a poster. This was what I was just talking about with the alcohol. So we see these relatively often. This poster says 1 in 3 reported rapes happens when the victim has been drinking. And what's striking to me is that the perpetrator is completely invisible. It says that rapes happen, right? Like they just happen, they just come out of the blue. No one's doing them to someone else. And so I think that's highly problematic about these kinds of things. It also doesn't acknowledge whether or not the perpetrator was drinking. So I think that's another component that frequently, like I said, gets left out of the conversation, and it puts the responsibility on victims to protect themselves rather than also making sure that people know to stop engaging in this behavior and naming that there is actually someone causing this harm. Another example is our bystander intervention training. So bystander intervention has become sort of the be all end all. Campuses across the country are using it as their mandatory intervention for incoming college students to address sexual assault, among other kinds of violence. And what's interesting about this is, it also doesn't focus on perpetration, it focuses on everyone around the perpetrator, which is important. It is important to make it a community issue. But then the other thing that's happening is, in order for bystander intervention to work, people have to see themselves as a member of the community that they are engaging with and attempting to sort of help. I don't like the word help, but that's what we're often talking about when we talk about bystander intervention. And one of the things that some research has shown us is that white folks in particular, white women in particular, are unlikely to intervene if the potential victim in a bystander situation is a Black woman as opposed to a white woman. So it's, again, another case of we're more likely to intervene when we see ourselves in a situation and when we consider ourselves part of a community. There are all kinds of racialized stereotypes wrapped up in this, and just outright racism wrapped up in this. So our culture has also been taught to not see Black women as potential victims, not see them as real victims. And so these kinds of things really scare me about bystander intervention programs. If we're using them as the be all end all answer, but we're only teaching students to intervene with people like them, we're setting up another example of a program that caters to people in the dominant group, or in this case, the majority group. So I think this is really important to be mindful of as we're moving forward in our bystander education. The other thing that we often focus on men as allies. When we're talking with college men on college campuses, we just assume they're all, quote, good guys, and don't think about the ways that good people can also engage in harmful behavior. And so when we approach everyone as a good person who would never do this, then we're not actually engaging that 1 out of 7 men who is engaging in harmful behavior. And so again, we're not addressing perpetration or perpetrator. I think the way to think about it is perpetration behaviors. So it's important to figure out ways to actually call out the behaviors that are harmful and let people know that even if you don't think you're being harmful, somebody else would experience this behavior that you're engaging in as harmful. So if we focus on the behaviors as opposed to the person, sometimes we could make some progress around teaching people what harmful behaviors actually are. The other thing that we see a lot, this is a study that was done that looks at the ways that campus websites do sexual assault prevention tips, is what they refer to them as. And so this these two researchers did a study, and they looked at 40 different campuses sexual assault prevention tips, and this is what they found were the most common tips. They also made note of who the audience for those was, and you can see here that their interpretation of these tips is that the vast majority of tips were for women. There was one that they perceived as being for men. The other thing that's interesting about these is that they're very much focused on stranger danger, and we know that the vast majority of sexual assault happens between two people who know each other. So things like avoid secluded areas, lock your doors, those sorts of things don't necessarily help if they're in a if the sexual assault happens in a situation where the two people know each other. So these kinds of tips, while well intended, are also problematic because they put the responsibility on potential victims. They specifically put them on potential victims who are women, and also they're not incredibly helpful. I don't know about you, but since I was 3 years old, I've been being taught to be aware of my surroundings and keep an eye out and don't go someplace by myself. All of those things are not, these are not novel. We know these things, and so they're not actually helpful. They just make us feel better at universities for having something on our website. So if we're going to actually engage in teaching people how to avoid sexual assault, paying attention to things like boundaries and teaching people, again, like I was just talking about, what harmful behaviors actually are, will get us a lot farther than these stranger danger tips. So I'm going to move on now to wrapping up with talking about what we can do with this information. So if we were in person, this is where I would stop talking and we would just have a discussion about what to do. But since we don't get to be in person, I'm going to talk a little bit through some of these implications. So one important piece is to learn our history and consider how it influences our work today. And for me, an example of this is VAWA. So by the Violence Against Women Act, like I said, has a lot of important pieces for the work around violence against women, is what it refers to as, or refers to. Some of that is around funding, those sorts of things. But the other piece of that is that funding is tied to criminal justice systems. So, and criminal justice systems, we know, benefit privileged white people, wealthy white people, or who benefit from criminal justice system. Criminal justice systems are actually disproportionately harmful to everyone else if you're not a wealthy white person. And so one of the ways that knowing our history can help us move forward is to interrupt this notion that increased reporting is the ultimate goal for our work. There's sort of, for a long time, I worked with victims and survivors as an advocate, and I can't tell you the number of people who would come to me and say, I don't want him to get in trouble, I just want him to stop doing this. And so their goal wasn't, they didn't want to report. And sometimes, yeah, that's because the reporting systems are crappy and all of that. But sometimes it's because they don't want the outcome that's available from reporting. And so when we make the reporting the ultimate goal, there's sort of like this shared assumption that everybody should report when things happen to them. That's very much rooted in dominance, and most specifically rooted in whiteness. So figuring out ways to present alternatives to the police and other kinds of authority as legitimate options for people's healing process is a very important part of knowing our history and how our history influences our work today. Additionally, thinking about the ways that power and identity in all of their forms influence our work is really important. So I gave several examples of those today. But I know for me as a white person, when I first started doing this work, I had never considered how the criminal justice system might be harmful to communities of color. And at that point, I hadn't even thought about how it could be harmful to queer folks. And so I think for me, having to really pay attention to how my identity and my power was showing up in the work, that was an example of some unlearning that I had to do in this process. Another suggestion I have is to use statistics accurately and to use active voice when we're talking about statistics. So naming the relationship between oppression and violence. So for example, you can see here, I say, perpetrators target bisexual women, gay men, trans people, indigenous women, and women with disabilities at even higher rates than our peers. So a few things about that. First of all, I'm naming specific identities so that people are recognizing that oppression is very much wound up with sexual violence. The other thing I did with this sentence is I started it with perpetrator's target. That is active voice. It puts an actor as responsible for this behavior. So often we end up focusing on, we use passive voice when we talk about this. So we'll say 1 in 4 college women experiences sexual violence. Well, experiences it by whom, right? Taking the perpetrators out yet again contributes to making perpetrators invisible and making it sound like this just happened. There's not someone responsible for doing it. Another suggestion is not to tokenize people. So one of the things when I talk about the bystander intervention and say like it's important that people see themselves as part of community, one of the things that we've started to see happening is that in bystander videos and different training materials, all of a sudden we're replacing the white people with very visible people of color, but not changing anything about the discussion around it or anything else. We just are tokenizing people of color by putting them in videos, brochures, that sort of thing, but not actually talking about the ways that racism and homophobia, ableism, all the other pieces intersect with violence to make people with minoritized identities experience higher rates of violence. And so not tokenizing, but actually working with minoritized communities to create educational programs relevant to their experiences is really, really important. There's so many programs that are just generically created, supposed to be a one size fits all, and even if not intentionally done, so they frequently focus on dominant group students. So heterosexual students, white students, students without disabilities are the people who are frequently centered in that work. Also interrupting dominant narratives about who perpetrators are. So not letting us keep talking about perpetrators as if they don't exist on our campus and making it so that perpetrators are those scary guys off campus, but really paying attention to the ways that perpetrators are among us. Similarly, shifting our programs and our workshops to focusing as much on perpetration as we do on victimization. So certainly, I would never want us to stop talking to people about how to set good boundaries and sticking with what they know and leaving a situation that makes them feel uncomfortable. I think those programs are important. It's important to empower people and make them feel like they can take control of situations when they can, but we can't make it only victims' responsibility or potential victims' responsibility to end this. We need to add on to the conversation talking about perpetration. And here's an example of a way that I did that in a program this summer. So these were sort of my tips for people at the end of the presentation. And it started out right away with don't hurt someone. And that sounds really obvious. People might be like, well, of course I wouldn't hurt someone. But then continue on by talking about if you're in doubt about whether a person wants to engage with you sexually, don't do it. The next point is if there are any questions or any lack of clarity, don't do it. Always ask for consent. Even when we're just hugging people, it's really important to ask for consent. I do this with my niece, and I have since she was a very, very little girl. And for me, this is a really powerful way to teach kids that they get to say no. So I ask for her consent and then I respect it. If she says she doesn't want to hug, she doesn't want to hug. So it can be a really powerful experience, and it's good for us to get in the habit of asking. I do this with students I work with. If I have a student in my office crying because something terrible happened in their lives, I'll ask them, would you like a hug, right? So that's not even can I hug you, because that still gives me the power, but I'm asking them, like, do they want to be touched? Would that be comforting for them in that moment? And that translates to so many aspects of our lives. Being clear with our boundaries, so being really mindful and saying if I don't want to do something, to say so. For me, being able to say no makes a yes even more powerful. So in thinking about being in romantic relationships or sexual relationships with people, when someone says yes, that is a very clear signal, and it in many ways is more powerful because you know the person is really wanting to engage. So sometimes I compare this. So if I call my friend and I say, hey, do you want to go see such and such movie, and they're like, kinda, not really. if I push them to go, it's not going to be fun because they're sitting there next to me and I know they don't really want to be there, right? And so thinking about how to both be clear with our boundaries, but then also be respectful of other people's boundaries is really important. Reflecting on our own beliefs and socialization around sex, relationships, and power is important. Deciding who we want to be in relationships and knowing that it's okay to change our minds as our ideas grow and develop. If you see somebody being a jerk, tell them to stop and get them out of the situation. That's an example of bystander intervention, but it really focuses on the person who's being a jerk and getting them to stop and leave the situation rather than pulling the potential victim from the situation. And then this last one is really hard, but I think it's important that we start doing a better job with this, which is engaging people who we know have caused harm, to get them to stop doing it. So we frequently will either ignore the behavior or we oust the person from our friend group. But if we know someone has caused harm or is currently causing harm, figuring out if they're getting help so that they can stop the behavior, and then figuring out ways that we can have empathy and compassion, meaning that we see them as a whole human being that is engaging in harmful behavior and they can stop that behavior if they get the help that they need, and then holding them accountable for that. So holding them accountable but not inviting them to parties or other gatherings until they get help. And then here, this last slide is my slide of selected references. These are all the references that I referred to throughout the presentation. A large number of these are those historical references. So you can pause your screen and write down any of them that you would like to dig into a little bit more. So that's the end of the presentation for today. I'm looking forward to engaging with you all very soon in a discussion forum sometime in November.